This is, well, he says confidently. So this is Art and I. Contact information, we'll give you contact information at the end. Of course, this presentation is going to be recorded so that you can download it or access it after you need. So I can't improve on Anne's beautiful introductions there. So what are we going to do today? We're going to start off with a little bit of the history on xAPI, how we got here. So we're really looking at what is xAPI, why is it important? One of the other questions that I get a lot, or that I hear often, is how's it different than SCORM? So is it just a new SCORM? What do I get an advantage of here? So we'll talk about that. Then move over into the anatomy of a statement. Again, not from a deep technical standpoint. We're not going to look at JSON. We're not going to look at JavaScript or any of that stuff. But we'll start peeling back the onions and peeling back the layers of that onion and start looking at what the pieces are that make up the statement. We'll talk about some success stories and then getting started. So, where did this whole thing come from? We'll take a kind of a long walk down memory lane way back in, 1988. Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and Airbus realized that they needed to be able to provide training to their clients, right, the different airlines, and have some interoperability, right? So they weren't having to create something new for each group. If you think about computer technology in 1988, this was a pretty daunting task, right? This was a big deal. So they published the AICC, Aviation Industry CBT Committee standard in '93, and that provided us an interoperability standard for content and learning management systems. Now, that still continues to run based on people that are using AICC content, to this day. But then the next level was SCORM. So the Department of Defense saw a similar need for interoperability for online training back in the late 90s, which kind of drove SCORM and its publishing in 2001. And what happened then is, with more technology innovation, increased focus on having an end-to-end learning architecture across the U.S. military, the DoD initiated the Experience API project. Really to, again, support the infrastructure that they're looking for over time. About that same time, the AICC was working on a new standard as well. They recognized the value of xAPI, and they went ahead and dissolved as an organization, and members joined the CMI-5 working committee under the ADL. So these things have continued to grow. We'll talk about CMI-5 a bit in a little bit later in the presentation, what the value is there. But a couple key things to help drive conformance after and adoption, for that matter. The ADL, back in 2017, they published their first xAPI conformance test. So you can have a list of certified learning record stores that have passed that conformance test. We know that they're going to conform to the specification. They also have a couple current projects going on. Profile Server project and a CMI-5 conformance suite as well are under development, and these will help standardize the way xAPI gets used across the industry. So exciting time there. One of the other interesting pieces is the IEEE is also looking at xAPI now as a specification. So there may be more international growth. So lots of excitement on the horizon, but wanted to start out with how we got to this point to begin with, because all these really build on each other. SCORM borrowed a lot of things from AICC. A lot of the terminology that you see in CMI-5 is a blend of that AICC SCORM language with xAPI. So worth having a little bit of a foundation there. Now we've talked about the history. What is this whole xAPI thing. I've got the, this is the official ADL definition there. The purpose of xAPI is to store and provide access to learning experiences in words. It's a lot of words. So I have a little less formal, a little more fluid definition that I prefer. The Experience API is a standard way of talking about experiences using data. Right? Basically, xAPI is just an activity stream of student actions, their behaviors, the things that they do that make up their history. Kind of think of that activity stream like, you know, Twitter without all the anger. But what are the advantages for us here in training? I think the most important thing in my mind is that xAPI really helps push us to make better instructional design and technology choices. What can I do with that learner data to improve their experience? What advantages of learning science research like spaced repetition and adaptive content can I leverage now with xAPI that I could not do before? And let's be focused beyond that existing web-based training and look at things like mobile applications that can provide training, inline performance support. So it's not a top-down, instructor-driven kind of experience that even in a web-based learning model, it still has that little hierarchical feeling to it. So as we become more comfortable with use inside the training world, this is where we should all be pushing ourselves to think of the ways we could leverage learner data to improve training and then how we're going to get that information. The last two items there on the screen, making integration easier and providing a better way to gather information. Providing a way to gather information. Clearly, we're pulling in data here, but the integration side and future-proofing to me are valuable. One of the benefits of xAPI is that it has built-in interoperability. So we should be able to move statements from one learning record store to the other or back and forth. And we'll get into those differences more, but one of the keys, again, in my mind, is that I can have learning data integrated with other data. As long as they're all speaking in xAPI, they're using that same syntax, that same vocabulary, then they all know what each other means without any middleware. So, okay, so there's my quick intro over to xAPI there. I'm gonna let Art talk about why xAPI is important so much now.
So why do we need xAPI now? If you think about it, everyone in your company or organization has better data than learning and development. This is a screen example of all the page views and all the clicks going on the website. They have great information in the marketing and financial and sales departments saying, you know, if we do this much marketing and we do it in this way, then we can expect to have this many sales and make this much profit. Well, even your Fitbit has more data about you than you have about your learners as they go through learning. What we have is SCORM. Now, SCORM has served us well. It has allowed e-learning to be portable between LMS systems. But mostly what you get with SCORM is a score, status, completed, not completed. Possibly you'll get answers to test questions, possibly not, and the duration of the content. Well, there's not an analysis, really a lot of analysis that we can do with that. It's just very little data to help us improve a student's performance with that kind of data. It's just not particularly helpful. So xAPI comes along, and I love this picture because it's a nice open toolbox. So there's a bunch of tools already built into xAPI that you can use, and we'll talk about that when we get to the anatomy of statement. But It's also open top box because we can add our own data to this. We can create our own spots for data and store data that may be unique to our industry, may be unique to our company, that we need to track and report on. So we're not limited by the fixed data model of SCORM. We have a completely open model with xAPI. We get asked all the time, is xAPI a replacement for SCORM? And no, it really isn't. xAPI is a data storage and data transport mechanism for mostly storing history. You can also store some stuff about an employee's profile or a student profile, and you can store state, but there's no sequencing, there's no settable passing score. It's just kind of hard-coded into whatever content you may develop. There's no mention of the LMS in the xAPI specification, and therefore there's no consistency. If you tried to make xAPI a player in the LMS world, xAPI by itself is not very interoperable for that kind of function. So CMI5 is actually the way to do that. CMI5 is a profile of xAPI, which means it's a set of rules for using xAPI in a particular scenario. In this case, the LMS launching content scenario, very similar to what SCORM does. You import a package, you launch it. But in this case, we're using xAPI to store the data. So we have an extensible data model, and a portable data model, and an interoperable data model, which we have less so with SCORM. Another areas where xAPI is important now is the changing technology. When SCORM was originally developed, mobile devices were this big, weighed 10 pounds, and about all you could do is make a phone call and possibly send a text to somebody. Remember the phones where you had to hit the button several times to get the particular letter that you wanted? Well, that's not a good training device. You might be able to do text-based training, but you can't certainly do the kind of modern training you want to deliver today. And SCORM is just not designed to run on mobile. It has a lot of issues with running on mobile. You can do it, but it's a lot of work, and it usually requires some sort of custom integration or a player. We also now have social learning. I think everyone now pretty much agrees that a lot of learning occurs outside of the LMS. In fact, most learning occurs outside the LMS. So we want to be able to capture training that occurs in other systems and other sharing mechanisms. Social learning like forums or discussion groups, gaming, simulations, on-demand content. Now, students want to be trained where they spend most of their time, which is on a phone, and they're portable, they're moving around. With COVID, they're now at home. So getting training to a mobile device is important, and we need training that a student can pull, not so much push. Most students today don't want to have stuff pushed. They want to be able to pull what they feel is relevant to them. We have a changing learner landscape as well. We have a lot of self-directed performance support where, again, students pick their own path through these things. Personalization is a big thing now, where students want things to be personalized to them, their career path to be personalized to them, and changeable, fluid. And we need all this to be delivered on remote desktops or remote mobile devices of many kinds. SCORM just doesn't support all of that very well, and xAPI was designed to handle the situation.
So a few things that xAPI does that help or can help satisfy those two issues, the changing technology and the changing learner demographics. So from a high level benefits standpoint, like Art mentioned, learning doesn't happen exclusively in the classroom or online. So the only things we're capturing now are generally those records. So why aren't we capturing the rest, right? The other non-traditional learning events that really should make up a student's transcript. Part of the benefits of xAPI is that learning can be tracked anywhere it occurs. With SCORM, I have to launch content from an LMS into a web browser, right? So those are pretty hard bounds to put on me. xAPI statements can be sent from a mobile app. They could be sent from a SharePoint site. They could be sent from a whole number of data sources that we'll talk about in a little more detail later. But just the standpoint that I don't have this requirement, this relationship where I have to launch content from a learning management system into a browser is a big help. There are other reasons that xAPI is better from a mobile standpoint as well. So another big benefit, data is portable. If you've ever tried to, if you have ever tried to migrate SCORM data from one LMS to another, you know this is a challenge, and normally what I see people doing is taking just scores, right? Grades, scores, the date that training was completed, and there's a lot more SCORM data behind the scenes that just doesn't get accessed there. So one of the benefits of xAPI is that you have to be able to move your statements from one LRS to the other, and they have to accept them as long as they're valid statements. The way we know they're valid statements is, well, amongst other ways, is that if they're going into a conformant LRS, a bad statement would be flagged, rejected. So again, interesting opportunities there for moving data around. Another is the fact that back with SCORM, we had to load content to the same domain as the LMS. Now, that was part of the specification, and there's some groups that did some work around things there, but those are generally out of spec and things that are not going to be interoperable with other systems. So you may know when you go to a website like a hotel booking or a airplane booking site, right? There are a lot of those controls, like a little calendar that drops down and the forward backward arrows and grids and things. Those are usually just pulled from what's called a content distribution network. So instead of having one copy of those files and scripts, they will that have to be downloaded every time you launch that page. What they can do is spread those libraries of controls across different content distribution networks around the world. So if I'm in Australia and I hit the hotels.com site, I'm going to get the closest version of the calendar control. Well, since SCORM blocked that, it meant that if I had content, say, loaded in the US, it could be very slow if I was running it in China or Australia or West Africa, where you're on very often metered satellite internet connections. So being able to take content, divorce it from the LMS also opens up the opportunity for content as a service, where my content provider doesn't have to send me a SCORM package. They can keep all that content on their own servers, and we're just referencing it. We don't have to maintain that content. So if they need to make updates, then they can do that, and we will just automatically receive them without going through the manual process of updating that course catalog. Already talked about Art already talked about, easy for me to say, extensible data. So being able to add more pieces of information to an xAPI statement so that I can capture that data for whatever reason I want to use, right? To analyze it for trends, or we'll talk about one of the success stories coming up where we're actually updating course catalog records in a learning management system from the extension data in an xAPI statement, which is kind of fun. Last couple of things, xAPI can be secure like anything else from an IT standpoint, right? There's a focus on cybersecurity there, and there are a number of tools. You have signed statements and other security around learning record stores. So at least if not capable of being more secure than SCORM, which is actually fairly easy to hack, since all of the data is really flowing as a HTTP post or HTTPS post, a web post. Then finally, there, a little bit more modern technology using RESTful APIs and all the data being tracked back as JSON data. Now, all of this stuff we could have done without xAPI, but you wouldn't want to. All of these things would have required some kind of custom ability or custom application built or some kind of middleware that, again, makes it harder to move that functionality from one organization to another. You get bound into that need to maintain a custom application. So, what are the things that xAPI pushes us to ask? So now, as we're considering a training or performance support solution, we have additional questions to ask ourselves. So, is there data that I can capture and use to inform better business decisions? Like who should be on a work team? How does training correspond to safety trends? Am I considering tools that can be integrated through xAPI, right? This, as I mentioned earlier, can minimize the cost of integration from middleware standpoint, and ultimately helps future-proof the investments that you have now, right? Because they will all be able to speak to one another. Is it possible for me to adapt content using xAPI to better fit my students? Or can I use xAPI for summative evaluation, right? Or users accessing the content. When they are inside the content, are there elements that they interact with or they don't? Things that they go to very often? And I feel like this is an important question now as, again, Art mentioned, the way learners are going out and pulling content. But a lot of our content has been created so that it runs in a linear fashion. And maybe we should reconsider that now in light of the fact that we have the tools to better track those individual pieces that we've really struggled with in the past. When you think about a learning management system model where it's the center of your learning ecosystem, you have courses and you complete those. But as we shift that learning management system from the center of my ecosystem and the LRS or LRSs become more prominent, I don't have to consider everything a course. I can look at training that someone gets from accessing a resource or getting a inline performance support pop up on the screen. So. Okay, so we talked about a lot about benefits and what we want to start asking ourselves with xAPI. So we're going to break down the xAPI statement a little bit here. We've talked about it a number of times and just haven't really taken a look at the individual pieces. So. Right, we said a statement is just the record of an observation, right? The key is the syntax for the statement that are defined that if they're used consistently, you can have good reporting on, right? So all we're doing is making this xAPI statement up of three primary parts, right? I have an actor, a verb, and an object. So the actor is a person, a group of people, something that has the ability to do something, right? Because that verb is the action word, right? That's my the thing that I am doing. So someone does a thing. There's my verb, and then normally there's an object, the thing that I did, right? So Duncan launched a rocket, right? Duncan launched rocket. I'll take the extra A out of that. Or Duncan completed performance review. because I can continue to extend this a bit more with like to someone. So Duncan completed a performance review on Steve. Let's say using stuff, maybe performed a performance review on Steve with our supervisor competency model, and then to some result, and maybe Steve ended up with 4.5 out of a 5-point scale. So again, just building all those individual pieces in together to start to structure the data that we want to keep. And we're going to dig into those statements and the individual elements a little more. But first, we've talked about learning record store a couple times. We haven't really defined it. Let's talk a bit more about where these statements are going to go. So a learning record store is the place, database, and it catches or stores that activity stream. So those things that are coming out of your different activity providers, your different data sources there. So it can be a standalone database that's, say, on a server someplace. It could be integrated into another system like an LMS or an HRIS. It could even be local to a piece of hardware. So I think about the example of my cell phone, right? I could have a local LRS installed that is part of maybe a mobile app, so that I can go through some kind of training or access some kind of resources offline, and then still upload that that data when I get the chance to sync back to my corporate LMS, the mothership. I always enjoy the DoD using the term the authoritative LMS. So again, nothing complicated here, just a way that we're going to capture those statements and record them so that we can go back in and use those. But, like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things that can send xAPI statements, and certainly not an inclusive list here, right? Anything that can send a message over a computer network, the internet, can be an activity provider or a data source for xAPI. Now, certainly think about the traditional e-learning stuff, right? That makes sense and fits into our model. But also things like ebooks or social platforms, chat groups or blogs, forums, games and simulations that run outside of the LMS maybe that I want to capture. We've got a couple of those projects you'll hear about at the end, talking about some success stories. And essentially, you can let your mind wander, right? If I have SharePoint and I want to see who is opening, or I'm sorry, not who is opening, but what documents are being opened, I can instrument SharePoint to do that. I have some brilliant geeky friends that have one of these little xAPI, just Internet of Things beacons that they put in their refrigerator. So every time you open the refrigerator door, it sends an xAPI statement with the temperature, the air pressure, and the altitude. Not that the altitude of your fridge should change often, but it was part of the sensor. So why not grab those things? Again, this is a kind of a nonsense example, but it's something that's possible.
Geeky, but if you think about it, what if you worked in a meat packing facility and you could track who left the refrigerator door open? Be a training opportunity.
Or how long.
Or how long.
Yeah, use a light meter to figure out when did the freezer door open, when did it go off. Yeah. So anyway, a lot of things there that that we can use, and realistically, one that I'll think about, and we'll talk about a little bit more, as well as your LMS, right? If your LMS is not an activity provider today, if it's not sending xAPI statements, it certainly should in the very, very near future. Now, okay, this is gonna back me up to another question that comes out. Again, lots of initial buzz with xAPI. People said, "Gosh, I'm going to just get rid of my LMS. I'm just going to have a learning record store." And there's some cases where that can be true, right? If I only need to capture some history, or maybe have a very light LMS. And I think a lot of the learning experience platforms are kind of moving this direction. They certainly are in our world, where we peel back to very specific needs or features. But remember, xAPI stores learning records. There are a lot of things an LMS does that you may still need, right? Sequencing of courses, user management, being able to do things like competency assessment and compliance reporting, setting up a schedule so that people can go in and register for online courses. Those are things that we just don't get inside the xAPI world, where we really just get those learning records. So if you still have a need for maybe tracking things like repetitive refresher frequencies for courses, then there's probably a need for some other LMS or LMS-like tool there. So again, just a question that I always like to clarify. So what we're going to do now is, you've probably heard me talk long enough, certainly Art has, sitting here. So I'm going to let him, I mentioned earlier, peel back the layers to the different, I say most common elements of an xAPI statement: the active verb, object, results, context, and extensions.
All right, thanks. So first of all, let's look at the actor, the first part of a statement. The actor is the who. It can be a person or a group of persons. A little bit of terminology. Sometimes you'll hear it called an agent, because the actor can be something other than an agent. We're not going to go into some of the technical details of what all of that is for, because we're just trying to give an overview. But in our case, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to consider an agent as a person and the actor in the statement. You can also make statements about groups. So if you have a team that's doing coordinated training together, you can make a list of agents and include them in as in a group, or you can make anonymous groups that are unnamed groups, essentially, or ad hoc groups. xAPI has multiple ways of identifying agents. To me, this is a little bit unfortunate because it can lead to a lot of mess. So you could, for example, use email address. Well, in my world, email address is not necessarily unique. So an email address may be shared by multiple people if they're co-working the job. So I don't really like using email, but sometimes it's the only thing you can use. You can also use something called an account, which in CMI5 is defined to be the way you must identify agents. CMI5 doesn't let you use the other ways of doing it as an xAPI profile. CMI5 is a profile with rules, and one of those rules is you must use the account method. So what we advise when we're talking with customers, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, that account method, from essentially a non-techie standpoint, is really the ID coming from the LMS, right? Because in that case, for CMI5, the course is being launched from the LMS.
Yeah, for practical purposes, that's true. An LMS could do something else. There's not a requirement that they don't use an employee ID out of the HRIS, but usually those two things are the same. So yes, in practical sense, that you're correct. Again, what we advise is that the most important thing about the actor is that you be very consistent about what you use to define them. If you use the account method, then try to always use the account method. If you use the mailbox method, then try to always use the mailbox method and define what mailbox it is. Is it your corporate email address? Is it your personal email address? Do you have more than one address? Then what's the primary that we're going to use? The reason for that is if I want to run a query against the Learning Record Store and see what one particular person did, I don't really have a method in xAPI to say, well, if the mailbox is this, or a mailbox is this, or the person ID is this, the account ID is this. That's just not a feature of the xAPI query facility. So it's best if you can define one way to define your actors. Let's move over to verbs, the second part of a statement. It's the action taken by the actor. The verbs consist of a unique identifier, And then usually you have the display value. Sometimes you have the display value in the statement in more than one language. It just depends upon whatever the object that wrote the statements did, what they filled in. For example, in most of our statements that we send from our learning management system, we include multiple translations of completed, for example. Now the unique identifier looks like a web address. It's kind of like a web address, but it doesn't have to resolve. So that means if I copy and paste that in a browser, it may resolve and you'll get some more information about the completed verb, but it's not required. It's really just a unique identifier that sort of ties back to a group that either developed or controls that particular verb. So don't expect them all to resolve. I've had questions about that in presentations, and people say, well, the verbs don't work because you paste them in a browser and you don't get anything back. They're not supposed to.
Well, I'd say, but the reason I think an example there, that launched verb that I had mentioned earlier, there are multiple verbs that are called launched, right? There's launched a rocket that the military or NASA might do, and there's launched a course that we may do in training, even though the name is the same, the word is the same, the description, display value. The identifier is what separates launching a rocket and launching a course.
Two wildly different things. So that is the purpose of the unique identifier. Some advice here, if you start working with xAPI and making statements, try to use existing verbs. There is no rule in xAPI that you can't make up your own verbs. It's not a good idea if one already exists because you'll have no consistency. So there's vocabularies on the internet that contain existing verbs that people have collected. For example, ADL, the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative of the Department of Defense, has one. To me, that's the most authoritative source.
Sure.
But they've incorporated a lot of the verbs that Rusticy Software used to have their own list as well. I believe most of that is now incorporated into the ADL library. And they have a vocabulary site where you can go and look at all the verbs and you can say, does that meet what I'm trying to do? It's possible you find that there isn't a verb for what you're trying to do. But you should always search really hard to try to find one that will fit your needs, so that statements made by whatever you're building will be similar to statements made by whatever somebody else is building if they address the same action. The object of the statement is required. These first three elements are all required. It's the target of the statement. It could be an activity. John completed War and Peace. It's good for John. That's a long slog. Object can also be an agent. So John raided Robert. So the actor in one statement can be the object in another statement. You can also reference a previous statement. Robert commented on John completed War and Peace. So John completed War and Peace was a statement that was written to the LRS, and then John came and commented on John having completed War and Peace. So that's, in that case, the object of the statement is in fact another statement. And we do this in our forums. When you post a topic or a question on the forum and somebody comments on it, we say that that person commented on this other statement. And that way we can get it all the way back up the tree to the original question and answers that were posted. And again, consistency is critical here. Don't call it War and Peace one time and something else the next time if you're actually referencing the same book, or you won't be able to get a report that shows you everything that happened with that particular book or object. Next, we'll look at the result property. The result is optional, but it can be very helpful. For example, if you're writing test questions, results, you want to have a score probably. You don't have to, but it would probably be useful if you're trying to analyze the data later. Success is a true-false value, so if you have something that they completed successfully, but you don't need to record a score for it, you can just say success true. And then completion, true or false, so that means they got all the way to the end. So it's possible to pass a test, not complete all of the content. Maybe you just skipped ahead to the test, so the completion might be false when success is true. This can happen. There's a response. This is used specifically when you're recording something called CMI interactions, which are test questions, basically. And so this is the response chosen by the user in answering that test question. So they chose answer A, for example. Duration, same thing as we have in SCORM. How long did this activity take for the statement? And then result extensions. Now, extensions appear in a lot of different things in xAPI, so we're going to cover that later on so we don't just repeat ourselves and cover it over and over and over again. Context. To me, context is one of the most critical parts of a statement. We always try to include as much data here as we can when we're sending statements. For example, the statement, Duncan experienced the Great Wall. Well, in Legoland. So the context here is in Legoland. Those are two wildly different statements. One indicates he might be good at hosting a travel tour to the Great Wall. The other indicates he might be good at hosting a Legoland tour at Disney World.
Not my strong suit.
Not your strong suit. So it's very important to record context. So when you're looking at the statements, you can say, oh, I understand this, what happened here very well. There's some available data options. First, there's a registration. Well, the registration usually means registration for a course. So when I enroll in a course in the LMS, we send statements about registration, for example. Who was the instructor? What was the revision number of the piece of content that I took? The platform is something you would need to define on your own end, exactly what that means. I've seen it used in a lot of different ways. For example, a group that has several LMSs writes which LMS the content came from, or the statement came from, to the platform property. I've also seen it used to say the platform was a Mac, or the platform was an iPhone, or the platform was an Android phone. So you can see what kind of devices. You just kind of need to develop your own rule around that one and come to a consistent way of using it among everybody who's writing statements. Context activities we're going to look at in a minute because that's a slide all of its own. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll look at extensions just a bit later. So context activities. These four things, the parent, the grouping, and the category and other, are collections or arrays. So you can have more than one parent, you can have more than one grouping, you can have more than one category, and more than one other. So in the parent, this might be indicating what is the parent of the particular activity that we're doing. So if we're taking a test in a course, then the parent of that test question might be the course. Or if it's a lesson in a multi-lesson course, it could be the lesson has a parent of the overall course. Grouping, so if a course is part of a curriculum, maybe these 5 courses make up one curriculum and this statement is about one of those courses in a curriculum. Well, it would be nice to be able to report for the student across the entire curriculum. So we can put the curriculum identifier into the grouping. Category. Category is used to identify a particular profile. And as we mentioned earlier, profiles are rules for using xAPI in particular scenarios. So CMI5 is the LMS launches content scenario. And so CMI5 has a category ID to identify that this statement belongs to that unique profile. And then other is just kind of a catch-all. You could just put just about anything in there that you want. Okay, I promised we would talk about extensions. The things that can have extensions are activity definitions, results, and context. So we just looked at results and context, and the object is what contains the activity definition. We didn't dive into that much detail there. Each extension consists of a unique identifier, probably one of those URL-looking things that we call an international resource identifier. Again, doesn't have to resolve, just has to be unique for when you want to report on it. You want it to always be the same. And then you have a data value. So for example, in CMI5, we have a session ID. So every time you launch a course or an assignable unit, which is a module within a course, a lesson, if you will, we have a session ID that identifies that unique launch, and it's tracked with every single statement that goes on during that statement. So the session ID might be a number, it might be a unique character string that identifies that particular launch. CMI5 also uses extensions for the mastery score. In CMI5, you can define a score that the student must achieve in order to move on from the course or satisfy the course is what it's called in the spec. So the satisfaction score, the mastery score, is written into the extensions. So if you're using different score for different groups of people, maybe some groups only need to get an 80 and others need to get 100, you can identify in the statement specifically which mastery score was used in that particular session. Another use, I mentioned this earlier, teased it, that we're now using some extensions to trigger LMS actions. We're going to call it LMS triggers, where an outside piece of content, something running, in this case, we're doing this for two customers, running on an Oculus, the VR headset from Facebook, that the training content is going to, at the end of the activity, if the student passed, they're going to send certain extensions that will trigger in the LMS to give credit for a course in the LMS. So a student is taking the training on the Oculus completely outside of the LMS, never logs onto the LMS, but it is right into the Learning Record Store. And we're monitoring those things coming in, and we're using that to trigger an action in the LMS. And it's fairly exciting. We get a lot of different activities that we could trigger if we start diving into that. My one recommendation on extensions is be careful to not use an extension where there is an existing property. For example, a couple of years ago, I saw somebody using an extension to define the test score that was achieved by the student. There's already a test score and result or score for the content anyway. So putting it in an extension just made reporting very, very difficult, and it really should go in the existing property. Extensions are there for things that don't already exist in xAPI. So your open toolbox, and you're throwing additional tools in there. If you can't find the hammer, and you know you got one, don't make a new one.
No, use an adjustable wrench. All right, so we've talked a lot about, or got into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty about how statements are really put together. And we had a little of that early philosophical discussion around, about the benefits of xAPI. So I wanted to really shift gears a bit here into getting started and what we can do. And I'm going to just follow on Art's last example there about the two Oculus projects. No one came to us and said we need xAPI for this. Can you help xAPI this so it works? The reality of it is they said, hey, we want to track this training, and we have someone already developing content on the Oculus. What do I need to do? It's like, oh, here, if you do this, you'll get credit in the LMS. We had a very, very similar one a couple years ago where someone said, our employees hate the LMS. I've got to be able to text to them a link that they can run content on their cell phone without logging on. As long as you can do it in xAPI or CMI5, we can make that happen. SCORM, not really as easy to do. So, so getting started, a lot of times it comes back to asking that question: how do I do this? It's like, all right, xAPI is my answer. I know what data I need there. So there may be some initial resistance to xAPI, and I always think you focus on the benefits, right? I mean, this can be hard for geeks like me, because I'm fascinated with how it works behind the scenes, right? And I'm certain there are plumbers that are excited about the latest plumbing technology. But for me, as a homeowner, I want to be able to turn on the faucet and have water come out. I don't need to know that much about the plumbing. It doesn't excite me. It's not something you can really sell me. Now, hot water and inside restrooms, let me write you a check. Let's make this happen, right? It's not the underlying tech. It's the functionality.
You've got inside restrooms now? Wow.
Yeah. We try, So one of the things is, you can start small. Megan Torrance, who sponsors xAPI cohort, we'll have a link for that at the end, as they've got a spring one coming up here. has a presentation called Day Hikes in xAPI. And they're all small projects that will help you learn about the spec, but also identify data problems, and give you a little case study at, for your no-cost options. And some of those are just working with existing systems that you had. If you have SharePoint and you want to use the free xAPI, or say if you have SharePoint, and you want to track who's running, or what SharePoint documents are being opened, you can use a plugin to do that. The ADL has a free YouTube player on their GitHub site, and there's a link to that at the end of the presentation. And if you embed that into a website and link into a YouTube video, you can track when it was launched, if they fast forwarded, if they completed it, whoever your user is. I really like, from a website standpoint, this little personal learning library applet. There's free code on the ADL website for creating this. This one's been modified by the Torrance Learning team, so it's a little prettier, has a little more functionality. But basically, what this does is, when I look at a web page, and instead of just continuing to open up hundreds and hundreds of browser windows, or creating bookmarks for, like, hey, I should read this, this is sending a bookmark into my learning record store. And if I want to go to history, I can pull those back out. But lets me rate something, put it into a category. Say there are some tags and some action items if you want to include those. Now, this works great for me, but I'm thinking about, if we had the organizational discipline to say, just for these categories, if we're going to research this or this or this, then go ahead and share those resources that you find and rate them. And maybe we can crowdsource within our organization some best practices or some best resources that are out there and available. So, benefits individually or as a group.
We'll say one thing before we move on,
Yeah.
is you do need an LRS to use any of this. So
Right.
there's actually a free resource that you can use on the ADL tools site. You can also use SCORM Cloud and spin up an LRS there. Now, you can't put in a lot of data, and you can't use these things for production projects. That's not what they're for. But they allow you to take these day hikes without spending any money.
That's right.
Or at least not very much.
Yeah, an LRS, once you get up to volumes of data, and you can make a lot of data very fast. So warning on that one. But on a small scale for testing, normally you can use a trial LRS. You may not have as much in the way of reporting capabilities, but they are certainly still there. Again, another existing system integration that I don't understand, I mentioned earlier, is why aren't all learning management systems sending records to a learning record store at this point? All kinds of things happen, right? So I register for an instructor-led course. Maybe it has to be approved by my supervisor. I might have to go in or may go in and search for courses. And from a learning standpoint, I might want to know what people are searching for inside the LMS, or what resources they're accessing. They keep going back to the same document. So again, something that's an existing system that should be sending some xAPI statements. Again, if yours isn't now, then it certainly should be in the very near future. Already mentioned blogs and forums when he's talking about context and grouping, right? So we have a little blog engine here, little blog system, and we started tracking all of those things, with all those interactions with xAPI. So if I post something to the discussion group, then that makes an xAPI statement. If somebody responds to that, again, that's an xAPI statement that we could track. So you can see those people that tend to become more active, though you are star performers. And the other thing, so we'll go to the reporting on this. As you can see in this supervisor visualization for the different forum topics, that, gosh, if I have something like competencies versus checklists there that a lot of people are asking questions on, or a lot of people are putting comments into, that may indicate to me that I need to consider developing some training for that area, or to beef up the resources that I have there.
So another use of xAPI is to evaluate use of materials. I've already mentioned SharePoint, and it's not actually very hard to write a plugin for that if you don't want to do it. There's one that's commercially available, and you drop it into SharePoint, and then every document that gets opened inside of SharePoint writes an xAPI statement. So you could find out a lot of that stuff we put out there 10 years ago, is it still valid? Do people use it? And are there opportunities to streamline it? For example, if you had an ebook that you published and you instrument it with xAPI so you could track which pages were viewed, maybe a lot of it isn't viewed. Maybe there's a chapter in it that's obsolete. Well, you could find this out with xAPI without having to go read through all those ebooks yourself. So let's take a closer look at that. Here, for example, is something that was mostly put together by one of our customers. If you don't recognize it, this is a Power BI, Microsoft Power BI, which is a business intelligence reporting tool. And they had us export a bunch of xAPI data to them. And in the chart at the top, I know it's hard to see, but it says passed and failed by objective. And we've got a list of objectives. And then you can see the big blue bar going across the top that says unknown. That's tests that are occurring in SCORM because it doesn't write the objective with the test question. So as a result of this chart, the customer began using something else to do test questions that they could track with xAPI and attach an objective to, so that they could get reporting on how people are doing by objective and focus on what objectives were missing, what objectives maybe are too easy as well. But they probably couldn't have found this information out without xAPI, or at least it would have been a lot of custom work. Another example of looking at usage is PDF annotating. We had a customer that uses PDFs, and they distribute them to people during a training class, and they needed to sort of secure them, not let them get out into the wild. So they had us modify the LMS so that it would allow you access to certain PDF documents, but you would never have a direct link to the PDF file. And then we allow annotations to go on inside of the documents. And this is sort of tracking usages and annotations that are being made on various documents in the system. Here's a little bit different graph. This is a particular document, and they're seeing how much pages are being used. Doc 1, open 180 times, Doc 2, a little bit less so. And they also see what the annotations are: highlights, underlines, notes, and etc. And then lastly, there's a keynote chart that, not keynote chart, thumbnail image. And you can see the thumbnails on the left. So those are pages out of the actual PDF document. And then on the right, for the highlighted document, you can see there's a page out of that PDF, and these are highlights that are being made by students. And down at the bottom, you can see student underlined something in the quiz. And notice here we're using anonymous data because we're really looking more at usage and not trying to tie this to specific individuals. There just wasn't a need for that. Another example of things in the real world is using an LRS to integrate data from multiple LMS systems. I mentioned earlier that I know somebody that has multiple LMSs in their organization. In this case, they had 20. And they're all over the world, and a person moved around with the organization, so he would have training in the LMS in one city. He'd also have training in the LMS in another city, and there was no way to get common reporting. The LMSs are basically incompatible. They're different vendor tools, and they could not report across the LMSs to get a complete picture of one individual's training. So their solution was to write programs that would read the data out of each LMS and transfer it to the LRS as statements. So then they've got one source of truth to make a report. So no matter which LMS you received training in, it gets converted to a statement in the authoritative LMS, as you mentioned, so that we can get reporting out. And this would have been a lot of middleware to do any other way than with xAPI. So the keys for success with xAPI, we always recommend that you start with a small project, do a pilot project, try to use a free LRS. You're not going to be sending tens of thousands of statements, so you can use something like SCORM Cloud or the ADL one, and then build from that. So you build a small project and you try to get results and then sell the benefits to your stakeholders, and don't try to sell the technology. Nobody cares. Yep. That it's xAPI. It just doesn't really matter. It just happens to be the way to do things like this, and your stakeholders don't really care about that. Wherever possible, we recommend you follow profiles that have already been developed. Those are the rules for the particular use cases that you might have, and standards. If you can't find a profile, at least try to use vocabulary like the ADL vocabulary to find verbs and activities and so on that you can use. Governance and data strategy are critical. We have a whole nother presentation that we do frequently on data strategy, because if you don't have a strategy when you get started, you'll have a mess when you get to the end. I can almost guarantee it, because xAPI is super flexible, and that's a strength and a benefit. If you don't have a strategy, it's definitely not a strength. And then share. I'm always amazed at the sharing that goes on in the L&D community of xAPI. It's not vendor against vendor most of the times. It's really kind of amazing. If we need help with something, we can reach out to some of our competitors even to review our statements and make suggestions to make sure we're sending good statements long before they get written to the LRS. And it's really, it's great. I love being in such a sharing community for such an interesting technology.
So here I've mentioned, as we've gone through, that we've got a number of resources out there. That first link is the ADL's GitHub site. There's a lot of free resources out there.
There's tools. There's the free LRS source code. Now, I do have to say that LRS is a little bit hard to set up. It does require an IT person to be involved. There's also some charts. Tools out there demoing how to fetch data and put it into representational graphics.
Yeah, I think one of the things that that they've really done well is put example files out. I was just looking at the CMI5 part of the ADL's GitHub site, and they've got entire course structures you can download and work with. Let's say Rustici has developer tools out there as well for xAPI, and I mentioned the Torrance Learning, both the bookmarklet and the cohort. So good way to get there. The risk blog, that's ours. We've got a lot of info on xAPI for, gosh, years back now. That bookmarklet, a direct link, WordPress xAPI plugin, YouTube xAPI player, again, that's out on the ADL site. There are probably others that I've neglected here, but I wanted to give you those resources. And with that, I was going to see if Anne was gathering up any questions there.
Yes, we have a question. Can you explain how an external system works with the LMS? For example, using sales data from a CRM in order to assign training in an LMS. Would that require an LRS?
Yeah, so if you could have a program in Salesforce that when certain events occurred, it sent data to the learning record store, and in our case, that trigger is actually unique to us. I'm sure other LMS vendors have something similar, but then we would read that statement as it came through into the learning record store and then write the credit record in the LMS. We're basically sniffing all the statements as they come through and saying, is this something that's a trigger within our system?
Well, and it could work either way, right? I could trigger something to essentially give someone credit for completing something, or I could trigger them to assign something, right? So if I had something that was a negative action, if you will.
Yeah, perhaps they failed the activity, and therefore you want to assign something else. So triggers can be used for anything like that, but it requires your LMS to support it. So it hasn't been defined in such a way yet as a profile to where it would work in all LRSs, but we're looking at that.
Awesome. And then I believe that one of the attendees raised her hand earlier. Elizabeth, did you have a question? If you'd like, feel free to pop it into the Q&A, or I can unmute your mic and you're able to ask the question live. Oh, I think she dropped off there. Are there any other questions? Well, this recording will be available. We'll send a link to access it via our Learnforia platform. I'll also make sure to include the links for the resources that Duncan has mentioned and share the slides as well. Are there any other last minute insights or anything that you'd like to share, gentlemen?
Oh, no, I really do appreciate all the time and, and your facilitation, and we always like to chat. So we are, we're xAPI geeks. Questions, thoughts, things you want to bounce off of us, we are easy to find, and look forward to learning about your next xAPI project.
And we're stuck in a bubble together, so any
That's
questions
right.
coming in would be great.
We have time, just we're here. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you everyone for attending today. You'll also be receiving a survey with any additional questions about any additional topics that you would like to hear about as well. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your week.